The morning her family sold her off like unwanted furniture, Abigail Reed overheard every word they said about her, and not one of them was kind. They thought she couldn't hear, they were wrong, and the man they handed her to, he wasn't what any of them expected. Neither was she. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay with me. This story is for you. Hit that like button, follow along, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Reed household on the edge of Red Hollow was not a warm place, and it never had been. It sat at the far end of Birchwood Lane, a two-story clapboard structure that looked respectable enough from the road. Freshly painted shutters, a clean porch, flower boxes beneath the front windows that Eleanor Reed tended every spring like they were her personal testament to the world. From a distance, the house looked like the kind of place where a family lived well, where daughters were cherished and fathers were fair and mothers were gentle. From the inside, it looked like something else entirely. Abigail Reed had grown up in the back bedroom, the one that faced the woodshed and caught no morning light. Her sisters, Clara, 21, and Josephine, 19, had the rooms that faced east, the ones that filled with gold every sunrise. That had been the arrangement since Abigail was 7 years old, the year her mother decided that certain things in life were distributed according to who deserved them. And Abigail, for reasons that shifted depending on the season and Eleanor's mood, never quite seemed to deserve the east-facing room. She was 24 now. She had long since stopped expecting it to change. What she had not stopped doing, and what her family had never been able to beat or shame out of her, though they had tried both, was paying attention. Abigail Reed noticed things. She noticed when the mill foreman underpaid the widows who brought in wash thread and told them to be grateful for what they got. She noticed when the town's appointed land surveyor marked boundary lines in ways that benefited his brother-in-law. She noticed when people looked away from things that were uncomfortable, choosing quiet over conscience. And she noticed the damage that silence left behind. Her family called it a problem. Her mother called it unladylike. Her father, Harlan Reed, called it the reason she would die alone. He wasn't cruel the way some men were cruel. He didn't shout, didn't drink himself mean, didn't raise his hand. Harlan Reed was cruel the way cold weather is cruel, steady, impersonal, and indifferent to the damage it caused. He looked at Abigail with the expression of a man examining a tool that didn't work the way it was supposed to, and he had spent the better part of her life trying to figure out what to do with her. It was the first week of October when Caleb Hartwell sent the letter. Abigail was in the kitchen when it arrived. Not because the kitchen was her assigned domain, but because she had been the only one awake at 6:30 when the postwriter came through, and she had taken the bundle of letters in out of the cold. She sorted them on the table without looking at the names until one envelope stopped her hand. The return address read Hartwell Ranch, Greystone Pass, Montana Territory. She knew the name. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the name. Caleb Hartwell was the kind of man whose reputation arrived in a room before he did, not through boasting, because by all accounts he didn't boast, but through the simple accumulation of what people said when they thought they were just making conversation. He owned the largest working cattle operation in the Northern Mountain Territory. He had built it from a single section of land his father left him, which had been rocky and marginal and which most people considered a bad inheritance. That had been 12 years ago. Now the Hartwell Ranch ran across 4 full sections, employed 32 men year-round, and was said to have the cleanest water rights and the straightest fence lines in the territory. He was 31 years old, never married, and had not, as far as Red Hollow knew, been seriously attached to any woman. Abigail set the letter on top of the pile and went to make coffee. She was on her second cup and halfway through the small account book she'd been keeping for the household expenses, a task no one had asked her to do, but which she did anyway because her father's records were a disaster, when her mother came downstairs. Eleanor Reed was 46 and had been handsome once. She still carried herself as though she were, which sometimes made the distance between who she'd been and who she was look wider than it needed to. "There's a letter from Hartwell Ranch," Abigail said without looking up. Eleanor stopped moving. The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. Abigail had learned to read her mother's silences the way other people read weather. "What did you say?" "The Morning Post. Hartwell Ranch. It's on top." She heard her mother cross the kitchen, heard the soft tear of the envelope, and then nothing for a long moment. Then footsteps, quick and purposeful, heading toward the stairs. "Wake your father," Eleanor called back. "Right now. Wake him up." Abigail did not wake her father. She finished her coffee, closed the account book, and went out to split the firewood before the morning got away from her. She was still at it when she heard the raised voices through the kitchen window. Not arguing exactly, more the sound of people who couldn't contain their excitement and weren't trying very hard. She kept splitting. It was Clara who came out to find her, around 7:30, still in her morning wrap, her fair hair pinned loosely. Clara was the pretty one, or so the family maintained, soft-featured, with her mother's coloring and an instinct for wearing it well. She was also not unkind, which Abigail had always considered her finest quality, and one the family seemed determined not to cultivate in her. "Did you read it?" Clara asked. "No. It's a proposal." Clara said it like she was still working out whether to believe it. "From Caleb Hartwell. For one of us." Abigail drove the axe into the block and left it there. "Which one?" Clara hesitated. That hesitation told Abigail everything before her sister said a word. "You." The word landed flat and strange in the cold morning air. Abigail looked at her sister. Clara was watching her carefully, with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something that might have been concern if Clara had been the type to let herself feel it openly. "Did the letter say why?" Abigail asked. "No, just the formal request. He wants to meet. Father's already talking about arrangements." Abigail looked at the woodpile, did a rough calculation, and picked up the axe again. "Tell him I'll think about it." Clara blinked. "Abigail, it's Caleb Hartwell. I heard you. I know who he is, Clara." Her sister stood there another moment, then went back inside. Abigail split 3 more pieces of wood before she let herself stop and think. The thinking didn't take as long as it might have. She had no illusions about why Caleb Hartwell's proposal had caused the reaction it did inside that house. It wasn't that her family was happy for her. She understood, in the clear and unsentimental way she understood most things, that to her parents this was a transaction. Caleb Hartwell was wealthy, connected, and apparently willing to take her off their hands. The fact that he had chosen her specifically, rather than one of the prettier, more manageable sisters, was probably already being reframed in her mother's mind as some fortunate accident that the family deserved credit for. What she couldn't figure out was why he'd asked for her at all. She had met Caleb Hartwell once, that she knew of, 6 years ago, briefly, on the steps of the Red Hollow Land Registry office. He had been there on some business she hadn't paid attention to. She had been there because old August Pell, 60 years old, worked 30 of them as a ranch hand, couldn't read, was being processed out of a claim that wasn't his to lose. The deputy land registrar, a man named Fowler who had a brother in the territory assessor's office, had been walking Pell through paperwork that appeared to transfer grazing rights Pell had held for a decade. Pell had understood enough to be frightened, but not enough to know what to do about it. Abigail had understood enough to do something about it. She'd been 20, and she hadn't planned it. She had simply walked through the office door, asked Fowler to explain the clause he was asking Pell to sign. And when Fowler told her it was none of her business, she had read the clause out loud to the room full of people waiting on the benches, explained what it meant in plain language, and asked if anyone in the room thought that sounded like a fair exchange for a man who'd worked that land since before half of them were born. Fowler had not been happy. The room had gone very quiet. Pell had not signed. She hadn't noticed Caleb Hartwell watching from the back of the room. She hadn't thought about it afterward at all. She'd just been angry, and the anger had needed somewhere to go. Her father called a family meeting that evening after supper, which was how Harlan Reed handled matters he considered serious. He sat at the head of the table with the letter in front of him like a document of great official importance, and he laid out his thoughts in the measured, deliberate way he had, as though he were presenting a case, though no one in the room was allowed to argue the other side. The proposal was to be accepted. The meeting would be arranged. Abigail would be prepared. "I'd like to read the letter," Abigail said. "I've told you what it says." "I'd like to read it anyway, since it's addressed to me." A pause. Her father picked up the letter and held it across the table without meeting her eyes. She took it and read it carefully. It was brief, 1 page, formal, courteous. Caleb Hartwell wrote that he had been aware of Abigail Reed for some time, that he believed her to be a woman of unusual character, and that he wished to propose a meeting with the intent of discussing a formal arrangement, if she was agreeable. He was not assuming her agreement. He was requesting it. The phrasing was deliberate and oddly careful. She read that last part twice. "Well," her mother said. "I'll meet with him," Abigail said. She set the letter back on the table. "But I'll be the one to decide after that." Her father's expression shifted, not quite to irritation, but close enough to it that the table got quiet. "You'll decide," he said slowly, as though testing the words. "That's right. Abigail." Her mother's voice had that particular sharpness to it. "You are not in a position to be selective." "I'm not being selective. I said I'd meet him. I said I'd decide after." She looked at her mother calmly. "Those are two different things." Clara was studying her water glass. Josephine was looking at Abigail with open fascination, the way she sometimes did when Abigail did something the family considered inexplicable, which was often. Harlan Reed let the silence stretch long enough to make clear that he didn't like it, then moved on, because there was no argument to be made that didn't reveal what he actually thought of the situation. And Harlan Reed, whatever his faults, was not a man who liked to reveal himself if he could help it. The meeting with Caleb Hartwell was scheduled for the following Saturday at the Red Hollow Hotel's front sitting room, a neutral location, which Abigail appreciated. It meant he wasn't expecting to come into her family's house and conduct this like a business arrangement between her father and himself. She thought about that. She also thought about the letter and the phrasing that wouldn't quite leave her alone. A woman of unusual character, not beautiful, not accomplished, not well-connected or pleasant or any of the things men usually cited when they were explaining why they'd chosen someone. Unusual character. From a man she'd spoken approximately 12 words to 6 years ago. She didn't know what to do with that, so she set it aside and focused on what she could control, which was how she showed up to the meeting. She wore the blue wool dress, not because it was her best. It wasn't, but because it was hers in a way the others weren't. Her mother had given Clara the gray silk and Josephine the green muslin and had bought Abigail the blue wool on the grounds that it was practical, which it was. Abigail had worn it so many times it fit her exactly right, and exactly right was what she wanted. She did not wear her hair in the elaborate arrangements her mother suggested. She put it up simply, the way she always did when she had real work to get on with. Her mother watched her prepare without speaking, which was unusual enough that Abigail noticed it. Eleanor Reed had opinions about everything, and she usually shared them at length. The silence felt less like approval and more like calculation. Caleb Hartwell was already in the sitting room when she arrived. She had built him up in her mind to some extent without meaning to, and she was prepared for the possibility that the actual man would be a disappointment, smaller than his reputation, or slicker, or the kind of person who wore his success in his face. She had met men like that. They had a way of entering a room that was designed to remind you of what they owned. He was standing by the window with his hat in his hands, watching the street, and he turned when she came in without any of the performance she'd been bracing for. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered look that didn't come from trying to look outdoorsy, but from actually working outside for years on end. Dark hair, a jaw that needed shaving, eyes the color of creek water in October, green-gray and direct. He said, "Miss Reed?" She said, "Mr. Hartwell." They looked at each other for a moment with the frank appraisal of two people who had decided not to waste time. "Sit down," she said, because the room felt better in motion, and then she sat down herself and waited. He sat across from her, turned his hat once in his hands, and then set it on the seat beside him. "I suppose you have questions?" "Several," she said, starting with why. He didn't flinch from it, which she noted. "Why you specifically?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not stalling, she thought, but considering how to say what he meant accurately. "Do you remember a man named August Pell?" She had not expected that. "I do. I was in the registry office that day. I saw what you did." Abigail looked at him. "I asked a question." "You asked a question in a room full of people who were very invested in nobody asking questions." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one. "I'd been in that territory 6 months. I knew what Fowler was doing. I'd been trying to figure out how to address it through proper channels for 3 of those months." He paused. "You walked in off the street and handled it in about 4 minutes." "Fowler kept his position," she said, "until the following spring, but Pell kept his grazing rights." He met her eyes. "And you know that wasn't really the point. The point was that you did it when no one else would, when it was easier not to. She studied him. He was telling her the truth. She had a reliable instinct for that, the same instinct that made her bad at polite social fictions and good at reading a room. He believed what he was saying. That was 6 years ago, she said. I know. You've been in Red Hollow since then? No, I went back north. But I've been back a few times on business, and I made it my business to know how you were getting on. He said it without apology, but also without pretension, like it was simply a fact he was reporting. I heard enough. Enough to write that letter. Yes. She leaned back slightly in her chair and considered him. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to be straightforward with you. Please. I don't know you. I don't have any particular reason to trust you. A letter and a meeting don't constitute a reason, however well written the letter was. She watched his face. And I have no intention of trading one situation that doesn't suit me for another one just because the second one has better acreage. Something shifted in his expression. Something that might, in someone less controlled, have been amusement. That's fair. If this is going to be a real conversation about a real possibility, then I need to know what you actually expect from a wife, from me specifically. She held his gaze. And I need to know you'll answer honestly, because I will know if you don't. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I expect a partner. Someone who does their own thinking and doesn't pretend otherwise. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong because I am wrong sometimes and I need to know it. He paused. I expect it to be hard work because the ranch is hard work and I can't run it alone anymore the way I used to. I expect we won't always agree. Another pause. And I expect we'll figure it out. Abigail said nothing for a moment. That's not what most men say, she said finally. No, he agreed. I expect not. She did not give him an answer that afternoon. She told him she needed time, and he said that was reasonable, and they parted at the door of the hotel with a handshake, which she offered and he accepted without making anything out of it. She walked home with the October wind picking up from the north, and her mind moving over everything he'd said, sorting it the way she sorted most things. Looking for the seams, the places where it didn't quite fit, the things he might have left out. She found less than she expected. Her family was waiting in the parlor when she got home. The three of them arranged with a studied casualness that didn't fool anyone. Her mother on the settee, her father in the wing chair, Clara and Josephine both finding reasons to be in the room that weren't actually reasons. Well, her mother said. I told him I'd think about it. The pause that followed was very loud. You told Caleb Hartwell, her father said carefully, that you would think about it. Yes. Harlan Reed set down the newspaper he'd been holding. Abigail, this man is... I know what he is, Father. Do you understand that an opportunity like this doesn't... I understand it perfectly. She was taking her coat off, hanging it on the peg by the door. Which is why I'm taking it seriously enough to actually think about it, instead of agreeing to something I haven't fully considered. Her mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. You'd do well, Josephine said quietly from across the room, and Abigail looked at her youngest sister, 17, still soft in the way she'd eventually grow out of, and saw genuine feeling there, something uncomplicated. I know, Abigail said, and meant it as an acknowledgement, not a boast. She gave Caleb Hartwell her answer 4 days later. A letter, brief and direct. She would agree to a formal arrangement, travel to the ranch for a period of introduction, and make a final decision thereafter. She was not agreeing to a marriage. She was agreeing to a serious conversation about one. He wrote back within the week. He said that was more than fair, and that he'd make arrangements for the 1st of November if that suited her. It was only after she'd sealed her reply and left it with the postwriter that she became aware she was being watched. Not from outside, from inside, from the hallway. She turned. Her mother was standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway, and her expression was the particular one she wore when she was working something out. Not upset, not pleased, just calculating. It made Abigail feel the way it always had, like a problem being measured. He'll tire of you, Eleanor Reed said. Not cruelly exactly, just certainly. When he sees what you're actually like, when he has to live with it. Abigail looked at her mother for a long moment. This woman who had arranged her whole life around being found acceptable, and who had spent 24 years finding Abigail's refusal to do the same to be an ongoing offense. "Maybe," Abigail said, "but at least I'll have been myself." She went upstairs to pack. The night before she left, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the back bedroom, the one that faced the woodshed, the one that caught no morning light, and stared at the ceiling and tried to make honest sense of what she was walking into. Not the romantic version of it, not the story of rescue that she knew her mother was already telling the neighbors, but the actual practical reality. She was going to a ranch she'd never seen, to live with a man she'd met once 6 years ago and spoken to properly for about 40 minutes. She was doing this because she'd read a letter with careful phrasing and looked at a man's eyes across a sitting room table and made a judgment call. She had made judgment calls before. She was usually right, but she knew the ways she could be wrong. She knew she was not always easy to live with. Not because she was difficult for the sake of it, but because she could not make herself smaller than she was. And she had never learned the art of letting things pass when they needed to be addressed. She had a sharp tongue when she used it, and a long memory, and a talent for seeing through things that people would prefer she didn't see through. She was taking those things with her. She couldn't leave them behind, even if she'd wanted to. What she didn't know was whether the man who'd said, "I expect a partner, and I need to know when I'm wrong," actually meant it when it was right in front of him, when it was daily and ordinary, and occasionally inconvenient. Most men didn't. Most men said things in front sitting rooms that dissolved like sugar in rain once they got home. She turned on her side and watched the darkness and told herself, "You'll find out. That's the only way you ever find out about anything." She came downstairs in the early morning dark to get the last of her things together, and she heard voices from her parents' room. Not raised, but not quiet either. The low, continuous sound of her parents talking in the way they did when they thought everyone else was asleep. She didn't intend to listen. She was crossing the hallway to get her traveling bag from the front closet when the words reached her anyway. Her father's voice first. "Good riddance, frankly. Man doesn't know what he's getting himself into." And her mother, "Give it 3 months. He'll have her sent back before spring." A pause. Then her father again, with the flat certainty of a man stating something he has long since decided. She was always going to be someone else's problem. At least now it's his. Abigail stood in the hallway with her hand on the closet door, and those words settling into her like stones into still water. She had known. In the way that you know things you don't let yourself name, she had known for a long time what her family's version of her was. She had not known how cleanly they would say it when they thought she wasn't listening. She stood there for a moment. Then she opened the closet, got her bag, and went back to her room to finish packing. She did not feel sorry for herself, which she considered important. She did not cry, which was not about toughness so much as the fact that she had already spent too many years letting her family's version of her live in her head, and she was done donating space to it. What she felt, standing there in the back bedroom that caught no morning light, with her bag on the bed and the whole wide, cold frontier waiting on the other side of the door, was something she hadn't expected. She felt clear, like a window after rain, like water after sediment settles. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely clear. She picked up her bag. She walked out. The wagon rode north out of Red Hollow, climbed for the better part of 2 days before it reached the elevation where the air changed. Thinner, sharper, carrying the smell of pine resin and something mineral underneath it that Abigail couldn't name but recognized as the smell of country that didn't care much whether you were there or not. She'd hired a ride with the mail courier, a lean, weathered man named Dodd, who spoke about 12 words over the entire journey, which suited her fine. She had enough noise in her own head without adding to it. She spent the first day watching the land shift from the flat, brown grass valleys around Red Hollow up into the foothills, where the scrub oak thickened and the road turned rocky underfoot. She spent the second day watching the foothills give way to real mountains, not dramatic in the way paintings made them look, but heavy and gray and indifferent, pressing in from both sides like they had business of their own to attend to. By the time Dodd turned off the main freight road onto a narrower track heading west, the afternoon light had gone flat and cold, and Abigail had been sitting on a hard bench for 9 hours with nothing to eat since a biscuit and dried venison at midday. She was tired, a little sore, and uncertain in the particular way that sets in when you've had time to think about a decision and can no longer tell whether the thinking is clarifying it or just wearing it down. Then the track curved around a long stand of lodgepole pine, and she saw the ranch. She had expected it to be impressive. Wealth has a way of announcing itself in the West through scale alone, through the sheer accumulation of fence line and roof line and open space that says someone spent a great deal of money here. What she hadn't expected was that it would look like it had been built by a person who intended to stay. There was a difference, and she felt it before she could explain it. The main house was big, but not ostentatious. 2 stories, timber and stone, with a deep-covered porch that faced the valley, and a stone chimney at either end putting up smoke into the cold afternoon. The outbuildings were arranged with a logic to them, not scattered but placed, like someone had thought hard about how work would actually move through the space. The fence lines ran straight and tight. The yard was not beautiful, but it was clean. A dog she didn't recognize came trotting out to meet the wagon, tail moving, nose working. Dodd reined up at the gate, and that was as far as he went. Abigail climbed down with her bag, paid him what they'd agreed, and stood in the yard as the wagon turned and started back the way it had come. She watched it go. Then she turned around. Caleb Hartwell was coming across the yard from the direction of the main barn, still in his work clothes, pulling off a pair of leather gloves. He'd clearly been in the middle of something when he heard the wagon. His jacket had a streak of something dark on the left sleeve, and his boots were muddy, and he hadn't done anything about either, which Abigail noted and filed away without deciding what to make of it yet. "You made it," he said, and the simplicity of it, no elaborate greeting, no performance, was its own kind of relief. "I made it," she agreed. He looked at her the way he had in the hotel sitting room, directly, without the social machinery most people kept running as a buffer. "How was the road?" "Long, cold. Dodd doesn't talk." "No," he said. "He doesn't." Something moved in his expression that might have been amusement. "Come inside. I'll have someone take your bag up." "I can take my own bag." A pause. Then, "All right." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door, and the first thing she noticed inside was that it was warm. Genuinely warm. Not the held-breath warmth of a house where the fire is only lit for company, but the steady, lived-in warmth of a place that runs a fire because people are actually there. The second thing she noticed was that it was not a particularly neat house. There were boots by the door and a jacket over the back of a chair, and a stack of papers on the side table that had not been organized for appearances. It looked like a house where a man actually lived and worked and didn't have anyone managing the impression it made. She didn't say anything about it. She just looked, the way she always looked, cataloging. He showed her the room she'd be staying in, upstairs, at the end of the hall, with a window that looked south toward the lower pastures. The room was simple and clean, the bed made up with good wool blankets, a washstand and a lamp, and not much else. It was the room of someone who expected their guest to have her own personality, and hadn't tried to impose one on her through decor. "Supper's at 7, he said from the doorway. "You're welcome to come down before that or not, as you like." She set her bag on the chair by the window. "I'll come down." He nodded and left, and she stood in the quiet room and looked out at the lower pastures, where the last of the afternoon light was going gray and thin, and a handful of cattle were moving slowly toward the shelter fence. She was here. She had made it this far. The thing to do now was pay attention. Supper was served in the kitchen rather than a formal dining room, which was either because there wasn't one or because Caleb Hartwell didn't use it. She suspected the latter. There was a ranch cook, a wide, deliberate woman named May, who had strong opinions about where things went and wasn't shy about telling you. And there were 2 of the senior ranch hands who apparently ate at the main house. An older man named Gus Fleury, who had been with the Hartwell operation since before Caleb inherited it, and a younger one named Patrick Teal, who was quiet in the watchful way of someone who was taking everything in. Nobody treated her arrival as anything unusual, which was either good manners or a deliberate signal from Caleb that they shouldn't. She suspected, again, the latter. The conversation at supper was about a section of fence on the north pasture that had come down in last week's wind, and what it was going to take to get it back up before a cold front moved in, and whether there was enough lumber in the storage barn or whether someone needed to make a run to Greystone Pass. It was entirely practical, and Abigail sat and listened and ate May's beef stew, which was good without being fancy, and let the shape of the place settle around her. At one point, Gus Fleury asked her, without any particular ceremony, if she'd grown up on a working property. "No," she said. "Town." "No horses?" "Enough to manage one." He seemed to accept that. Patrick Teal asked a few minutes later whether she'd done much cooking, and May gave him a look that suggested the question was about 4 steps past his authority to ask. And Patrick went back to his stew. Caleb, across the table, said nothing. He ate steadily and efficiently and refilled her water glass when it ran low without making a gesture of it. And she found that this simple, unremarkable series of things, the stew, the practical conversation, the unremarkable refilling of the glass, was doing something unexpected to the tightness she'd been carrying in her chest since she'd stood in the hallway of her parents' house and heard her father's voice through the door. It was loosening, not gone, but loosening. After supper, she went back upstairs and then changed her mind and went out to the porch instead, because the air had cleared and the sky was doing something magnificent that she didn't want to miss. The kind of high country dark where the stars look structural, like they're holding something up. She could hear the horses moving in the near corral and the distant sound of cattle and the wind in the pines along the ridge. And she stood there with her hands in her pockets and just breathed. She heard the door behind her after a few minutes and didn't turn. Caleb came and stood near the porch rail, not beside her exactly, but in the same general space, and was quiet for a while. He was holding a mug of something. Coffee, she assumed, though it was late for coffee. "May's tea," he said, apparently reading her look. "She makes me drink it when the weather's coming in. Claims it helps." "Does it?" "I have no idea," he said, "but May has opinions and I've learned not to argue with them about certain things." Abigail almost smiled. "What kind of weather's coming?" "Snow by Friday, maybe Thursday, if the front moves faster than expected." He looked out at the pasture. "We'll need to get the cattle down from the north sections before then." "That's what the fence talk was about." "Partly. The fence is its own problem." He turned the mug in his hands. "The north section is higher ground, better grass in the summer, but the first hard snows come there fastest. We lost 3 head last November because we waited too long." She looked at the darkness beyond the yard. "How many head are up there now?" He glanced at her, something shifting in his expression, a small recalibration, like he'd been expecting a different kind of question. "About 60. How long to move them down if you start at first light?" "Most of a day, if the fence is sorted." "Then you'll need to start on the fence tomorrow." "Yes," he said, "we will." Though we landed between them without either of them acknowledging it directly. Abigail looked at the stars, and Caleb drank his tea, and the night was cold and clear, and there was nothing performed about any of it, which was something she had not known she needed until she was standing in the middle of it. After a while she said, "You should know I'm not good at pretending. I know that. If something's wrong, I'll say so. If I disagree with the decision, I'll say that too. I won't do it in front of your men or behind your back, but I'll say it. I'm counting on that." She turned and looked at him directly. "Most men say that until the first time it happens." He met her eyes. "I'm not most men." It wasn't a boast. He said it the way someone states a fact about terrain. "Here's the ground. Here's what it is." She studied him for another moment, looking for the crack in it, the place where the certainty was covering something shakier. She didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there. It meant she hadn't found it yet. "All right," she said. "Good night, Mr. Hartwell." "Caleb," he said. She paused at the door. "Good night, Caleb." She was up before 5 the next morning, which surprised May, who was the first one in the kitchen and hadn't expected company. Abigail got out of the way of the cooking and sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee and the household ledger she'd spotted on the side shelf the evening before, because she had asked whether she could look at it, and Caleb had said yes without asking why she wanted to. She could see why when she opened it. It wasn't a disaster. Someone had been keeping records, and the records went back 3 years and were mostly accurate. But the system was inconsistent. The categories shifted from one quarter to the next, and there were several entries she couldn't reconcile at all. Large numbers moved between accounts with annotations that said things like CF, Spring Settlement, without explaining what settlement referred to or whether it had resolved. She found at least 2 places where she suspected a significant expense had been entered twice. May came and looked over her shoulder without asking and said, "Gus keeps that." "I can see that." "He does his best." "He does," Abigail agreed. "He's just not an accountant." May made a sound that might have been agreement and went back to her stove. By the time Caleb came down at 5:30, Abigail had 3 pages of notes and a cleaner picture of where the discrepancies were. He came into the kitchen, looked at her, looked at the ledger, and poured himself coffee before he said anything. Find something? 2 double entries that I can see clearly, and at least 1 payment I can't reconcile to anything. There might be more. I'd need to see the original invoices. She looked up. This CF spring settlement entry from March of last year. What's that? He sat down across from her. He had the look of a man who had been outside already, even at this hour. There was cold in his jacket and he'd pushed up his sleeves already, a habit she'd start to notice. Payment dispute with a timber supplier over a roof contract. We settled it in the spring. He took 50 less than his original claim. And it was entered as the full amount? A pause. Apparently. So there's $50 sitting somewhere that shouldn't be. Caleb looked at the ledger and then at her. Gus is going to feel terrible about this. He should feel relieved, she said. Finding it now is better than finding it later when it's compounded across 5 more entries. She closed the ledger. I can sort it if you want. It'll take most of a morning. He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, more like someone placing something carefully, making sure it lands where he means it to. Yes, he said. I want that. She nodded and opened the ledger again, and Caleb finished his coffee and went out to start the fence repair. And May cooked breakfast, and the ranch moved into its morning rhythm around her like she was a point. It had always been organizing itself around, which was strange and quiet, and nothing like what she had expected. The fence took 2 days, not 1. The damage was worse than the initial assessment, which Gus delivered with the expression of a man who hates bringing bad news and has learned he has to anyway. 2 full sections of the north line had gone down in the wind, and the posts on a third had heaved with the early frost and were no longer plumb. Caleb made the call to do it properly, rather than quickly, and set his crew to full repair instead of the temporary patch that would have gotten them through the immediate problem. Abigail heard this discussion from the yard where she'd come out to see about the horses. She had no role in the decision and didn't try to insert herself into it. But she watched the way Caleb ran it, the way he listened to each man's read on the situation before he gave his own, the way he made the call clearly and without second-guessing himself once he'd made it, and the way Gus and Patrick and the others moved into it without dragging. That evening, after the crew had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, she mentioned it. You run a good crew, she said. He looked up from the map he'd been studying. Grazing rotation for the coming season. They're good men. They are. But that's not the whole of it. She was at the other end of the table with the sorted ledger and her notes. The way they move when you give a direction, that's not just good men. That's someone who's earned it. He looked at her steadily for a moment. You watch things. I do. Does it ever turn off? She considered the question seriously. Not really. No. He made a sound. Not dismissive, something more like recognition. Me neither. He looked back at the map. It makes some people uncomfortable. I know, she said. It used to bother me that it did. It doesn't anymore. He didn't say anything to that, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, very slightly, in a way she couldn't have described, but noticed all the same. Boom. The cattle came down from the north section on the 4th day, which was Thursday, which was the day the front moved in faster than expected. The snow started around noon, dry and serious, the kind that means it, and by the time the last of the 60 head were through the lower gate, the yard was white, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 2 hours. Abigail had spent the morning helping May put up the storm shutters on the east side of the house and making sure the wood supply on the porch was stacked properly against the wall, where the overhang would keep it dry. She had not been asked to do this. She had seen what needed doing and done it, which was how she'd always worked, and which in her parents' house had been treated as a kind of aggression, an implied criticism of whoever hadn't done it first. When Caleb came in from the cattle drive, cold and wet through despite his oilskin, he stopped in the mudroom doorway and looked at the porch wood and then at Abigail, who was coming down the stairs with an armful of blankets for the men who'd be cold from the drive. He said, "Thank you." She said, "The east shutters were already starting to work loose. You'll want to look at the hardware in the spring." He looked at her for a moment. "I will," he said. "Thank you," he said again, and this time it was for more than the wood, though he didn't say that part. She just nodded and went to distribute the blankets, and the snow came down hard outside, and the ranch held its ground against the weather the way it had been built to, shutting. It was May who said it first, in the unself-conscious way May said most things. Without setup, without cushioning, just the words laid out like something she'd finished thinking about and had decided to report. "You're not what any of us expected," May said. They were in the kitchen on the 5th evening, working on the week's baking. Bread for the crew, mostly, which May managed alone, but which Abigail had started helping with because the kitchen was warm and the work was straightforward, and she slept better on days when she'd done something physical. "What did you expect?" Abigail asked. May considered it, kneading with the systematic pressure of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Someone more worried about making an impression. Girls who come out here to marry a ranch owner usually want it to show. The house, the position. They want you to see them in it. Abigail shaped her section of dough without comment. "You walked in and went straight to the ledger," May said. "First morning. It needed sorting." Things need sorting every day. Most people wait to be asked. May looked at her sideways. "Caleb's been running this place alone a long time. He's gotten used to carrying everything himself because there was no one else." A pause. "It's not good for a person. Carrying everything alone." Abigail thought of the lines she'd seen in his face when he was tired. Not old lines, but the specific kind that come from sustained effort, from the weight of being the one who has to keep deciding. She had recognized them, in the way you recognize a version of something you know from the inside. "No," she said, "it isn't." May nodded once, returning to her bread, and didn't say anything else about it, and Abigail was grateful for that, for the statement without the pressure of it, the observation offered without obligation attached. She shaped her dough and put it to rise and thought about carrying things alone, and about how long she'd been doing it herself, and about the particular exhaustion of that, and about what it might mean, carefully, without letting herself run ahead, to be in a place where that might not be required anymore. Outside the kitchen window, the snow from Thursday's storm was still on the ground, and the mountains were white to the middle slopes, and the last light of the day was going down behind the western ridge in a long, thin line of cold orange that was not beautiful in any soft or easy way, but was real and still and entirely its own. The weeks after the first snowfall settled into a rhythm that Abigail hadn't expected to find comfortable, and did anyway. She woke early, earlier than anyone but May, and the quiet hours before the ranch came fully alive became hers in a way she hadn't had since, she couldn't remember exactly since when. Her parents' house had always been loud with the particular noise of people performing their version of themselves for each other, and even the early mornings had carried attention to them, the held-breath quality of a household waiting for the day's first grievance to surface. Here the mornings were simply quiet, the fire in the kitchen stove, the sound of wind off the mountain, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular cold that came through the gaps around the window frames that nobody had gotten around to resealing. She had resealed 3 of them by the end of her second week, using rope caulk she'd found in the storage room. Nobody asked her to. She'd felt the draft, found the material, done the job. Caleb noticed. He didn't make a ceremony of it, just said, one morning over coffee, "You found the rope caulk." Storage room, second shelf. "I've been meaning to do those for 2 years. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He looked at her. "How?" "The draft pattern. The ones I fixed weren't random. They were the same 3 windows, north-facing old frames. Someone had put rags in the gaps at some point. That's a temporary fix that works until it compresses and then stops working. Someone knew they needed proper sealing and ran out of time or forgot." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "My guess was you did the rags yourself, probably 2 winters ago, and it's been on the list since." He was quiet for a moment. "3 winters ago," he said. "There you go." He shook his head, not in dismissal, but in the way of someone absorbing something that surprised them slightly. "You're going to make me feel like the ranch has been falling apart without me noticing." "Not falling apart," she said, "just accumulating. Places do that when one person is managing everything. The urgent things get done and the important but not urgent things pile up." She looked at him directly. "You haven't been failing. You've been outnumbered." The way he looked at her after that. She filed it away without naming it, the way she'd been filing things about him since she arrived. Not building a case, just paying attention. The snow that had come in Thursday's front stayed on the ground through the rest of November, which meant the cattle work shifted into its winter mode, feeding rotations, ice management on the water troughs, checking the herd twice daily for signs of illness or injury that the cold could mask until it became serious. Caleb ran this with the practiced competence of someone who had done it so many times it was muscle memory, but Abigail could see, once she understood the shape of it, where the gaps were. Not in what he did, but in what he was tracking in his head versus what was written down. She started keeping a daily log, not because he asked her to, but because the pattern she saw in his operation suggested that a significant amount of critical information existed only in Caleb Hartwell's memory, and that was a fragile place to keep it. She showed him the log at the end of the first week. He sat with it for a long time, turning pages, saying nothing. She watched him read and tried to gauge his reaction the way she always gauged things, looking for the tells, the places where the response didn't match the surface. What she saw was a man who was genuinely surprised, and then, underneath the surprise, something that looked uncomfortably close to relief. "The Dunmore heifer," he said finally. "You put her on a separate watch." She was favoring her left rear leg. It's subtle, but it's been consistent for 4 days. Either she picked up something in the north pasture before the move, or she's developing something in the joint. Either way, she needs attention before the next hard cold. He closed the log. "Gus noticed it too," he said, but he didn't say anything because he wasn't sure he was seeing right. He set the log on the table between them. "How did you learn this?" "I watched," she said. "I've been watching since I got here." "You grew up in town." "Yes, but I've been paying attention to things my whole life, whether they were useful to me or not. Animals, people, systems, they all have patterns. Once you see the pattern, you can see when it's off." She shrugged, a small, self-deprecating motion she hadn't intended. "My mother always said I was too observant for my own good." "Your mother was wrong," he said, without heat, just as a statement of fact. She looked at him. He held her gaze without backing off it. "Yes," she said. "She was." The Dunmore heifer had a swollen joint that was caught early enough to treat. Caleb and Gus dealt with it the following morning, and the heifer was isolated and comfortable by afternoon. At supper, Gus told the table that the early catch had probably saved the animal, and Patrick Teal looked at Abigail with the particular expression of someone revising an earlier assessment. "You do this kind of thing before?" Patrick asked. Not rudely, just with the directness of a young man who hadn't yet learned to soften his curiosity. "No," she said. "Seems like you did." "Paying attention isn't specific to ranching," she said. "It works in most situations." "She sorted the ledger too," Gus said into his stew conversationally. "Found $50 Fowler's timber fraud missed in the first pass." "Gus," Caleb said. "I'm just saying she's useful," Gus said, unperturbed. "Not an insult." May at the stove made a sound that was either agreement or suppressed laughter. Abigail decided not to examine it too closely. "I'm not sure useful is the word she'd choose," Caleb said. He was looking at Abigail when he said it, and there was something in the look that was careful, asking, in the way he sometimes asked things without using the words. "I'll take useful," she said. "I've been called worse." The thing about living in close quarters with another person, something Abigail understood in theory but had not had the opportunity to test in practice, given that her family's version of closeness was more accurately described as mutual occupation of a shared space, was that it stripped away performance over time, whether you wanted it to or not. You ran out of the energy required to present a version of yourself, and what was left was just you in the ordinary grain of daily life, which was neither flattering nor unflattering, but simply true. She burned a pot of beans one afternoon because she got absorbed in recalculating the winter feed budget and forgot she'd put them on. The burning smell reached the upstairs landing where Caleb was going over supply invoices, and he came down to find her standing over the stove with an expression that was equal parts irritated and resigned. "Did the beans survive?" he asked. "The top layer," she said. "The rest is a loss." He looked in the pot. "May's going to have thoughts about this." "May is in town with Gus until Friday. This was my operation entirely." She moved the ruined pot to the cold side of the stove. "I had the feed numbers in my head and I lost track. It happens. Not to me, usually. She looked at the pot with honest displeasure. I don't like losing track. I know. He said it without irony, without teasing, just acknowledging a fact about her that he'd observed. What were you finding in the feed numbers? She told him, not the burned beans anymore, just the problem at hand, the way she always moved back to the work because the work was real and containable in a way that feelings about burned beans were not. He sat at the table and listened and asked one good question and then another, and they spent the next hour going through the winter projections together, and the beans were scraped out into the yard for the dog, and it was fine. Later, she thought about the way he'd done that, stepped past the small embarrassment of the burned pot to the thing underneath it, which was the work, which was what she'd actually been doing. He hadn't made her feel careless. He hadn't made her feel anything except heard, which was not something she was particularly accustomed to and which she was still working out how to carry. There was a night in the third week of November when the temperature dropped hard and fast, below anything that had come before it, and Caleb woke her at 2 in the morning because one of the water lines to the east barn had frozen, and if it split before they got heat on it, they'd lose the line entirely, and potentially the barn wall section with it. She was dressed and out the door in 5 minutes. They worked the frozen line together for 2 hours by lantern light, Caleb with the hot water application and the pipe wrapping, Abigail holding things, handing things, and at one point lying flat on the cold ground to get a better angle on the fitting at the base of the wall while Caleb held the lantern over her head and gave directions. The cold was serious, the kind that gets into your face and stays there, that makes your fingers slow after 15 minutes no matter how you try to keep them warm. She made mistakes. Twice she handed him the wrong fitting, and he corrected her without impatience, just no. The other one, the wider thread, and they kept moving. They got the line saved. Afterward, they sat on the bench inside the east barn door, not quite willing to go back out into the cold immediately, sharing the blanket Abigail had thought to grab on her way out of the house because she'd known this was going to take a while. The horses were restless with the temperature but settling. The lantern threw a circle of yellow light around them. You move fast, Caleb said. He was still a little out of breath. You woke me up saying we were going to lose the wall, she said. That seemed like motivation. Most people need a minute to... He stopped. You were functional in about 30 seconds. I don't sleep heavily. She looked at her hands, red from the cold, a little unsteady. I never have. My brain stays too close to the surface. He was quiet for a moment. Mine too, he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the horses, the lantern light catching the side of his face, tired, genuinely tired, the kind that doesn't fully leave a person who's been running a large operation alone for years. She had seen that tiredness in pieces over the past weeks, in moments when the performance of competence dropped briefly and what was underneath showed through. She never said anything when she saw it. It wasn't her place yet, and she knew the difference between what she'd earned the right to say and what she hadn't. But sitting here in the barn at 2 in the morning with her hands red from the cold and a water line saved and the horses settling in the dark around them, she felt the distance between what she could say and what she wanted to say become a little shorter than it had been. You're tired, she said. He didn't deny it. Yes. Not just tonight. A pause. No. Not just tonight. He turned his hat in his hands. The same gesture from the hotel sitting room, she noticed. Something he did when he was being careful with words. I built this place to work. I know how it works, every part of it. Another pause. But knowing how something works and having someone to work it with are different things. She understood that. She understood it from the inside. Yes, she said. They are. He looked at her then, and the look was the direct one she'd come to expect from him, but different in some way she couldn't quite categorize, less measured, less organized, more like the face of someone who is no longer sure what they expected versus what they're actually finding. She didn't look away from it. He said, I think you know I'm glad you're here. I think I know that, she said carefully. I'm still deciding what I know about the rest. That's fair. I'm not saying it to be cautious, she said. I'm saying it because it's true. I haven't figured out yet what this is. She held his gaze. I know what it isn't. It isn't what I came from. It isn't... Obligation or performance, or someone counting what they paid and expecting return? She paused. That's more than I was sure of a month ago. He nodded slowly. Then that's where we are. That's where we are, she agreed. They sat a little longer in the cold barn with the horses and the lantern, and then went back inside, and the night was too cold and too late for anything else, and that was all right. The next 3 weeks moved through her like the change of light, gradual, then unmistakable. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, through sustained, patient attention. She learned the logic of the grazing rotation and the water rights map, which she redrew more legibly than the version in Caleb's records. She learned which of the horses had temperament issues and which were just undertrained. She learned that Gus Fleury had bad knees that he refused to acknowledge, and that this was why he took the fence work slower than the younger men, and why Caleb always put Patrick Teal on the tasks that required kneeling in the cold. She learned that May had come to the ranch 11 years ago, under circumstances nobody mentioned, but which the way she occupied the place, fully, without apology, told her something about. She also learned things about Caleb Hartwell that she couldn't have gotten from a letter or a 40-minute conversation in a hotel sitting room. She learned that he was patient with animals and less patient with machinery, and that when a piece of equipment failed, he had a set of reactions that went from assessment to frustration to problem solving in quick succession, and that the frustration stage was brief but real, and he didn't pretend otherwise. She learned that he read at night, not fiction, mostly territorial maps and land reports and the occasional agricultural pamphlet, which was not romantic but was entirely consistent with who he was. She learned that he didn't ask for help easily, and that when he did ask it, cost him something small that he tried not to show. She learned that he watched her the way she watched things, carefully, without making it obvious, piecing together a picture. One evening, she caught him at it directly. She'd been crossing the yard to the storage barn and turned back because she'd forgotten the inventory list, and he was standing at the kitchen window where he thought she couldn't see him, watching her cross the yard, and the expression on his face was nothing like the measured, composed face he wore in the ordinary run of the day. She stood still for a moment and looked back at him through the glass. He didn't immediately look away, which told her something. He held her gaze for a beat longer than he should have, and then he stepped back from the window, and she turned and went to the storage barn and stood inside the door for a minute before she could make herself focus on the inventory. She had known, in this way you know things before you're ready to name them, that something had been shifting between them for weeks. In the evening, conversations that ran longer than they needed to, in the way he turned toward her voice when she came into a room, in the small adjustments he made without being asked that fit the specific shape of her days rather than a general idea of courtesy. She had noticed all of it and filed it away and told herself to be careful, because she had been wrong about people before, and the cost of being wrong here was different from the cost of being wrong in Red Hollow, where the worst outcome was an argument with her mother. Here the worst outcome would be harder to survive. Not physically. She had no illusions about any threat from Caleb Hartwell, who was the least threatening person she'd met in a long time. Emotionally. That was where she was exposed, more than she liked to admit. She had spent 24 years managing the damage of people who were supposed to love her and didn't, not the way it counted. And she had built something solid around herself from that experience, something functional and protective and necessary. And she was aware that what was happening slowly in the daily grain of this life on this ranch was working at the edges of it. She was not entirely sure she wanted to stop it. The argument, when it happened about a horse. Specifically, it happened about a bay gelding named Ridgeline that one of the seasonal hands had brought in on a sale recommendation, and which Abigail had noted on 2 separate occasions was showing signs of a respiratory condition that the seller had probably known about and not disclosed. She put it in the log. She mentioned it once, briefly, to Caleb, who had said he'd look at it when he had time. A week passed, and he hadn't looked at it, and the horse was worse, and Abigail brought it up again at supper in front of Gus and Patrick. Caleb's response was measured, and she could see it was controlled. He said he had been aware of it, that he was waiting on a vet visit already scheduled, that the timing was his call. She said, "The vet visit isn't until Thursday. The horse sounds worse today than he did Monday. Waiting until Thursday is a choice, but I want to make sure it's an informed one." Caleb looked at her across the table with an expression that was not angry exactly, but had something in it. The edge of a man who doesn't love being questioned in front of his crew, even if the questioning is fair. I'm aware of the situation, Abigail. I know you are. I'm asking if you've heard him in the last 2 days. A silence that had a particular texture. I'll go out after supper, he said. Thank you. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her plate, and the table found a different conversation, and that was the surface of it. Underneath it, she could feel the residue of something real, not catastrophic, but significant. The first time she'd pushed and felt him push back. He went out after supper and came back inside 20 minutes later, and he came to find her in the main room where she was working on the rotation schedule, and he stood in the doorway and said, "You're right. He's worse. I'm sending Patrick to get the vet tomorrow instead of Thursday." She looked up from the schedule. Good. He stood there another moment. I don't love being called out in front of the crew. I know, she said. I tried once alone first. I'll try harder to keep it there. He looked at her steadily. That's all I'm asking. That's fair, she said, and I'll do it. But I won't stop saying it. Whatever the setting. The corner of his jaw tightened briefly and then released. He nodded once. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. And there was something in his voice that, underneath the tiredness and the residue of the friction, sounded almost like a man acknowledging out loud what he'd already known privately. He left her to the schedule. She sat with the argument's aftertaste, the way it had felt to say the hard thing directly and have it land and not be the end of something. And she noticed, with the honesty she applied to most things, that what she felt wasn't anxiety. It was something closer to the feeling she'd had standing in the hallway of her parents' house the morning she left, with her bag on her shoulder and the whole cold frontier ahead of her. Clear. Not easy. Not comfortable. But clear. Ridgeline recovered. It took 3 weeks of careful management. The vet confirmed a low-grade respiratory infection that had been present, as Abigail had suspected, longer than the seller had admitted. There was a course of treatment, a modified feeding arrangement, and a period of isolation from the other horses that Patrick Teal managed with more diligence than anyone expected from him, given that he was 22 and had the attention span of someone 22. Abigail kept the recovery log. By mid-December, the gelding was sound, and Caleb put him in the south pasture rotation where the air moved clean off the lower valley, and that was that. The episode settled something between Caleb and Abigail that neither of them formally acknowledged. The argument, and the way it had resolved, had worked like a test that both of them had passed in different ways. He had heard her. She had been right. He had acted on it without making her pay a price for being right, which in her experience was not as common as it should have been. And she had followed through on what she'd said. The next time she had a concern she thought he needed to hear, she took it to him alone first, in the early morning before the crew was moving, and he listened with the kind of attention that told her he'd taken what she said seriously. They had found a way to disagree without it becoming damage. That was not nothing. That was in fact the thing she'd been most uncertain about when she'd made this decision, and its resolution sat in her somewhere quiet and solid. December deepened and the ranch moved into its coldest stretch. The days were short and the work was relentless in the particular grinding way of winter ranching. Not dramatic mostly, just constant. Water, feed, fences, checks, repairs. The weather came in waves, a hard storm followed by a brief warming followed by another hard cold, and each cycle required adjustments and decisions and the kind of sustained physical effort that left people quiet and tired at the end of the day. Abigail found that she did not mind it. She was not someone who needed ease, she needed to be useful, which was different. And here she was, consistently and specifically useful in ways that had nothing to do with being decorative or agreeable or whatever other qualities her family had decided she lacked. She was also, in the way she was reluctant to name but couldn't honestly avoid, happy. Not loudly happy, not in the way she associated with the word from the outside. It wasn't giddy or expansive or particularly visible. It was the quiet kind. The kind that lives in the ordinary texture of a day well spent, in the warmth of a kitchen at 6 in the morning and a problem solved cleanly and a person across the table who looked at her like she was exactly who she was supposed to be. Caleb told her about his father on a night in late December, when a storm had pinned them both inside for the second straight day and the supper had stretched long because there was nowhere else to be. Gus and Patrick had retreated to the bunkhouse. May had gone to bed. It was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the remnants of supper and the lamp burning down and the wind coming hard off the mountain outside. And he started talking in the way he sometimes talked when his guard was down, not with the careful, considered delivery he used in the daylight hours, but looser, following the thought where it went. His father had been a difficult man, not violent, not dissolute, just cold in a way that seemed constitutional, like something in him had been turned off early and never turned back on. He had built the original section of the ranch, and he had worked it hard, and he had expected his son to understand that the work was what mattered, and that everything else, warmth, acknowledgement, the simple act of being seen by your father, was a luxury that real men didn't require. Caleb had spent most of his young life trying to prove that was true. "I was good at the work," he said. He was looking at the table, not at her. "Better than he expected, I think. He didn't say so. He wasn't going to say so." A pause. "But I was 23 when he died, and I had this ranch, and I knew how to run every part of it, and I had nobody to run it for and no idea what to do about that." Abigail listened. She didn't offer anything, not comfort, not equivalence, not the reflexive reassurances that people reach for when someone says something that costs them. She just listened, which she had found was what he actually needed, the same way she sometimes needed someone to sit with the weight of a thing, rather than immediately help her put it down. "You built it anyway," she said, when he'd been quiet long enough that it seemed right to say something. "You build what you know how to build." He looked up then, and the tiredness in his face was the specific kind she'd stopped being able to look at without feeling something move in her chest. "I knew how to build the work. I didn't know how to build the other thing." "The other thing?" "A life," he said, "inside the work. That's—" He paused, looking for the language. "You can run a ranch perfectly, and it doesn't mean there's anything real inside it. I knew that. I just didn't know what to do about it." He looked at her steadily. "Until I saw you in that registry office, and I thought, there's a person who knows how to be real inside the work." The lamp between them was burning low, throwing soft, uneven light across the table, and the storm was loud outside, and Abigail sat with what he'd just said and felt it settle into the territory of things that changed the shape of other things. "I wasn't doing anything exceptional," she said. "I was just angry." "You were honest when it cost you something." His voice was quiet, certain. "That's not nothing. That's actually most of it." She looked at him. This man she had been watching and measuring and filing away for 2 months, who had turned out to be exactly what he'd presented himself as, and not a thing less or more, which was rarer than it should be. Who had given her room to be herself from the first day, and had not once tried to smooth her down into a more manageable shape. Who burned her with questions about cattle feed and found her burning beans, and had never once made her feel like she was failing at something she was supposed to have mastered. "Caleb?" she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do." "Tell me then." She took a breath. Not for courage. She had enough of that. For accuracy. "I came here prepared to leave," she said. "I told myself it was a serious conversation about a possibility, and that's what it was. I had every intention of being honest with you, and then going back to Red Hollow and building something on my own if this wasn't what I thought it might be." She held his gaze. "I'm not going back." A silence that had weather in it. "Not because of the ranch," she said. "Not because I don't have other options. Because this—" She stopped, started again. "Because you're the first person I've met who looked at who I actually am and didn't ask me to be less of it." She felt the vulnerability of the statement like cold air on a burn, and she didn't look away from it. "That's not a small thing." He was very still across the table. Then he said, "No, it isn't." "So?" She straightened slightly, the practical part of her reasserting itself because she needed to stand on solid ground when she said what came next. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to make it formal, I want it to be for those reasons. Not because I got tired of waiting to decide. Not because it's convenient." She looked at him. "Real reasons." He reached across his table, not to take her hand, just to set his own on the table between them, a gesture that was offering rather than claiming. "Real reasons," he said. "That's all I wanted from the start." She looked at his hand on the table and then at his face. "All right then," she said. They were married in January, in the Greystone Pass County Clerk's office, with Gus Fleury and May Hendricks as witnesses. The ceremony took 9 minutes. There was no large gathering, no performance of it, which suited both of them in ways they didn't have to explain to each other. May cried a little in the way May did most things, briefly, practically, without making it anyone else's business. Afterward, they ate a proper meal that May had prepared back at the ranch, and Gus made a toast that was mostly about the waterline repair that he'd been telling the story of since November, and Patrick Teal gave Abigail a carved wooden box that he'd made himself out of juniper, which surprised her enough that she had to take a moment before she could thank him properly. It was not a grand thing. It was a real thing, which was better. Das. The letter from Red Hollow came on a Tuesday in late February, 3 weeks after the wedding. Abigail recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for several minutes before she opened it. Not because she was afraid of it, because she wanted to be clear before she read it, grounded in what she knew about herself and this place and this life she'd built, rather than reading it from the old position, the one she'd spent 24 years in, always slightly off balance, always braced. She opened it when she was ready. The letter was 3 pages, which was long for Harlan Reed, who was not a man given to extended written communication. The first page was formal, setting out, with the deliberate precision of a man who'd practiced law long enough to know how to arrange facts for effect, the current situation of the Reed family finances. The Territorial Land Commission had opened an investigation into survey irregularities across 3 counties. Several prominent landowners, including families the Reeds had built their social and financial position alongside for 20 years, were under scrutiny. Credit that had been extended on the basis of those relationships was being called. The bank in Red Hollow had indicated it would not be renewing the Reed family line. The second page was explanation. Not apology, never that, but explanation. The circumstances were external, the result of forces beyond his control. The investigation was almost certainly going to conclude without finding any direct wrongdoing on his part, but in the meantime, the damage was real and immediate, and the family was facing a genuinely difficult period. The third page was the ask. He wanted money, a substantial loan, enough to bridge the gap until the investigation concluded and credit could be reestablished. He framed it carefully. Not charity, a loan, with terms, which he laid out with the same precision he'd applied to the rest of the letter. He mentioned twice that he was coming to her as family. He mentioned once, at the end, that he hoped she understood what it had cost him to write this letter. Abigail read it twice. Then she folded it and put it on the table and sat with it. Caleb found her there when he came in from the morning rounds. He looked at her face, then at the letter on the table. "Bad news?" he asked. "From my father." She pushed it toward him. "Read it." He read it standing, still in his coat, and she watched his face and saw the moment he understood what he was holding. Not just the request, but the architecture of it, the careful legal framing, the calculated appeal to family feeling from a man who had never demonstrated family feeling in any direction that cost him something. He set the letter down. He didn't say what he thought about it, which she appreciated. He said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the letter. "I want to go there. I want to see it in person." She looked up at Caleb. "I need to see his face when he says it." He didn't question why she needed that. He understood her well enough by now to know that she processed things by looking directly at them. "When?" "Next week, if the road's clear enough." "I'll come with you." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, in the way he said things that were settled. "I'm coming." They reached Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, the road having been passable if not pleasant, and pulled up to the Reed house on Birchwood Lane in the mid-afternoon gray. The flower boxes were empty and the porch hadn't been swept recently, and there was a quality to the house's appearance that Abigail recognized. The specific look of a place where the maintenance of appearances was starting to slip behind the effort required to maintain it. Her mother answered the door. Eleanor Reed looked at her daughter and then at Caleb Hartwell standing half a step behind her, and for a moment her face went through several things quickly. Surprise, calculation, the reflexive social machinery switching on. "Abigail," she said, "you came." "You wrote," Abigail said. "Your father wrote." "Yes." Abigail looked at her mother. This woman who had told her she would die alone, who had calculated the cost of her departure from this house and found it acceptable. who had stood in this doorway 100 times with the expression of someone waiting for Abigail to become something more useful. "Are you going to let us in?" They came into the parlor, which was colder than it should have been, and had the stale quality of rooms that aren't heated properly through the winter. Clara appeared briefly at the top of the stairs and then disappeared, which was Clara managing difficulty by not being present for it. Josephine was not in the house. Away visiting, their mother said, which Abigail thought was probably the family's way of keeping the youngest out of whatever this conversation was going to become. Harlan Reed came in from his study. He was 61 years old, and he had always looked like a man who was in control of the room, and he did not look that way now. He looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps just less certain, which produced the same effect. He looked at Abigail with the expression of a man who has rehearsed a scene and is now confronting the possibility that the other person hasn't read the same script. He looked at Caleb with the particular assessment of a man who is calculating what kind of power is in the room and where it sits. "Sit down," her father said. "I'll stand," Abigail said. A pause. Caleb said nothing and stood quietly at her side, which was exactly what she needed him to do without having to tell him. "You got my letter," her father said. "I did." "Then you know the situation." "I know your account of the situation," she said. "I'd like to hear you say it directly, without the legal framing." She looked at him steadily. "What happened, Father?" He told her. It took about 20 minutes, and as he told it, she could see the places where the legal framing had been smoothing things, the way certain associations had been not quite corruption, but not quite clean either. The way the survey irregularities that were being investigated were connected to land dealings that her father had been adjacent to without being technically liable for. He was probably right that direct charges against him would be difficult to make stick. He was also, she understood, not entirely innocent of the world that had produced those irregularities. He had lived in it and benefited from it, and looked away from the parts he needed to look away from to keep doing so. She had known that about him for years. She had not known that she would have to sit in his parlor and watch him try to make it someone else's problem. When he finished, he looked at her with the expression she had spent her childhood trying to earn the other version of. Not this one, not the asking for something one, but the straightforward, unconditional one. He had never given her that version. This was the version she got. "You've done well for yourself," he said, and the words that should have been a compliment landed as what they actually were. An acknowledgement of her value now that it was useful to him. "I have," she said. "Not by accident. The ranch is... Hartwell has a good reputation in the territory." "Caleb," she said. "His name is Caleb." She felt Caleb beside her, steady and quiet, and she kept her eyes on her father. "And yes, it's a good ranch. We've worked hard at it." "Then you're in a position to..." "Oh, I know what position you think I'm in," she said. "I want to say something before we talk about that." Her father stopped. He wasn't used to being interrupted, and it showed, but he held himself together. She took a breath and said it cleanly, without heat, because she had spent the 3 days of travel deciding that she wasn't going to do this angry. Angry would let him make himself the victim of her emotion. She was going to do it clear. "The morning I left," she said, "I was in the hallway. I heard what you said to Mother. Good riddance. She was always going to be someone else's problem." She watched his face and saw the color shift in it. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition of exposure. "I want you to know that I heard it. Not because I need you to feel badly about it. Because I've been carrying it, and I'm putting it down today." She paused. "You didn't see me clearly. You made up your mind about who I was when I was very young, and you never looked again." She kept her voice steady. "That's your loss. I've made my peace with it." Her father said nothing. His face was doing something complicated that she didn't try to read. Her mother, in the chair by the window, was looking at her hands. "As for the money," Abigail said, "no, I won't lend it." The room changed temperature. "Abigail," her father started, "not because I want you to suffer. Not as punishment." She looked at him directly. "Because the situation you're in is the result of choices that have been building for years, and a loan from me won't change the choices. It'll just delay the reckoning." She paused. "What I'll do is this. I'll write to the county credit union in Greystone Pass and ask them to hold a small line for necessary household expenses through the spring. Not a rescue. A bridge for the basics, while you sort out what's actually salvageable." She looked at him. "That's what I can offer in good conscience." He looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, because it was made of too many things at once: frustration, something that might have been humiliation, and underneath both of those, something quieter and harder to name. "That's your answer," he said finally. "That's my answer." He stood there another moment, and then he nodded once, a short and formal motion, and turned and went back to his study without another word. Her mother sat very still in the chair. "Eleanor," Caleb said, the first thing he'd said since they walked in, and the gentleness of it surprised her, using her name, addressing her directly as a person rather than an obstacle. "The offer she's making is a real one. Take it." Her mother looked at Caleb and then at Abigail, and her face was the face of a woman who had built her entire sense of the future on a particular map and was only now beginning to understand the map was wrong. "You turned out well," her mother said to Abigail. It wasn't an apology. It might have been the closest thing to one Eleanor Reed knew how to offer. Abigail looked at her for a moment. "I turned out myself," she said. "I was always going to." They left Red Hollow before dark, getting back on the road while the afternoon light still had some warmth in it. Abigail sat in the wagon beside Caleb and didn't speak for the first mile, and he didn't push it, just let the horses find their rhythm and the road unspool ahead of them. After a while she said, "Thank you for what you said to my mother. She needed to hear something that wasn't coming from you." "Yes?" She looked at the road ahead. "How did you know that?" "Because you'd said everything that needed saying from you," he said simply. "There was nothing left for you to give that room." She thought about that. "You were watching the whole time." "I was watching you," he said, "the whole time." The road north climbed into the foothills, and the light went thin and cold, and the mountains ahead of them came up gray and solid and familiar in the way that places become familiar when they're yours. And Abigail felt the Red Hollow distance growing behind her with each mile, and felt it not as loss but as release. She had gone back. She had said what needed saying. She had not set herself on fire to warm people who would only complain about the smoke. She had also done something she hadn't fully expected. She had offered her parents a real thing, not from obligation, not from guilt, but from the clear-eyed assessment that the right response to being treated badly was not to replicate it. That was its own kind of strength, and it was hers. And she had found it standing in that cold parlor with Caleb steady at her side. She shifted slightly on the wagon seat so that her shoulder was against his arm. He adjusted his grip on the reins without comment, and the contact held warm and solid and unremarkable, which was exactly what she needed it to be. The horses moved north, and the mountains grew larger, and the road was long, but it led home. The ride back from Red Hollow took 2 days, and by the time the Hartwell Ranch came into view around the bend of lodgepole pines, Abigail felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained act of being honest in a room that doesn't want honesty. It sat differently in the body than regular tiredness, heavier in the chest, slower to lift. She was glad for the cold air and the familiar shape of the main house against the gray February sky, and she was glad, in a way she no longer tried to qualify, to be coming back to it. May had kept the fires going, and there was soup on the stove, and she didn't ask questions, which was one of May's finer qualities. Gus and Patrick were out on the late afternoon rounds. The dog met them at the gate. Everything was exactly as they had left it, which was its own kind of answer to a question Abigail hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She slept deeply that night for the first time in a week. In the morning she was up before 5, as always, and she sat in the kitchen with her coffee and her notes from the winter feed review, and she let the quiet of the place settle around her like something she deserved, which was a feeling she was still learning to accept without suspicion. She had spent so many years in a house where the quiet was always the pause before something went wrong that she'd developed a reflex against trusting it. Here the quiet was just quiet. Here it meant everyone was sleeping and the fire was good and the morning was hers. She thought about her father's face in the parlor, the way he'd looked at her when she gave him the answer he hadn't wanted. Not the expression of a man confronting his wrongs, because she didn't think Harlan Reed had arrived at that particular reckoning, and she wasn't sure he ever would. But the expression of a man who had looked at his daughter and seen, maybe for the first time, that she was something other than what he'd decided she was when she was 7 years old. That she had become, on her own terms and without his permission, someone he didn't have a category for. She didn't need him to understand it. She had long since stopped requiring that, but she had needed to go back and say what she said and stand in that room and feel the difference between who she'd been when she left it and who she was now. Not as a triumph over him, but as a private accounting, a way of measuring the distance she'd covered. The distance was real. That was enough. March came in raw and mean, the way mountain springs often did, teasing warmth for a week and then turning hard again, giving the land whiplash. The cattle work shifted into calving season, which was the most labor-intensive stretch of the ranch year and the one that most tested the entire operation's capacity to pay attention simultaneously to a dozen things. Abigail had never attended a calving season before. By the end of the first week, she had attended 11 of them, which was to say she had been in the barn at odd hours, watching and assisting, and on 2 occasions doing considerably more than she'd expected to when the situation moved faster than the experienced hands could get there. The second of those occasions produced a story that would be told at the supper table for the rest of the spring. It was a first calf heifer, young, confused, and in distress at 3 a.m. when the only person near the east barn was Abigail, who had gone out to check on the water trough situation after a temperature drop. She had enough by then to know what she was seeing and enough sense to know she needed Caleb, so she went and got him, and he came out in 4 minutes in his coat over his long underwear, and they worked the delivery together for 40 minutes in the cold and the lamplight, and when it was done and the calf was down and the heifer was doing what she was supposed to do, Caleb sat back on his heels and looked at Abigail across the animal, and she was covered in things she'd prefer not to think about, and her hair had come entirely down and she probably looked nothing like a person who had any business being there. He started laughing. Not the controlled near smile she was used to from him, but actual laughter, the kind that comes out when a person has been too tense for too long and the release is its own relief. And it was so unexpected from him that she started laughing too, and they sat in the hay of the east barn at 4 a.m, being completely ridiculous while the heifer attended to her calf, and it was one of the realest moments she'd ever lived inside. "I thought you grew up in town," he said, when he could speak. "I did." "You assisted a calving delivery." "I assisted something," she said. "I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing." "You did fine." "I did what needed doing. There's a difference." He looked at her with the look that she had long since stopped filing away and simply allowed herself to receive. Direct, warm, the one that didn't have any performance in it. "That's you exactly," he said. "That's exactly what you do." She looked back at him in the lamplight, this man in his coat over his long underwear with his hair disordered, who had built a serious and respected operation and was sitting in the hay being laughed at by his wife at 4 a.m, and she felt the full weight of how fortunate she was. Not in the abstract, grateful for abundance way, but specifically and precisely. Fortunate that he'd been in the back of that registry office 6 years ago. Fortunate that he was the kind of man who watches and remembers and acts on what he sees. Fortunate that she had been stubborn enough to walk in that door instead of walking away. She almost hadn't. That was the part she thought about sometimes. She had stood at the edge of the decision and nearly talked herself out of it, and she was grateful to the version of herself who hadn't. Spring moved through the ranch slowly, and then all at once, the way seasons did at elevation. Weeks of barely perceptible change, and then a week where everything shifted and the grass was suddenly green in the lower pastures, and the creek ran high and loud, and the light came back an hour at a time until the evenings were long enough to work by again. The calving season finished with a better survival rate than the previous 2 years, which Gus attributed to the early catch of the ridgeline infection in the fall. A contained problem, he argued, would have spread to the calving herd if it had gone untreated, and the cascade would have been difficult to manage. He said this at supper in his usual conversational tone, as though it were simply a fact about the season's outcome, but Abigail saw him look at her when he said it, a brief, straightforward acknowledgement, and she accepted it the way she'd learned to accept things from Gus, without fanfare, as one professional to another. Patrick Teal had grown during the winter in ways that had more to do with attention and responsibility than age. He'd taken the ridgeline recovery seriously and had developed, over the calving season, something like genuine skill at reading animal behavior that he hadn't had in November. He was still 22 and still direct to the point of bluntness, but the bluntness had acquired some of the judgment that keeps it from becoming a problem. Abigail thought he was going to be a very good rancher in about 5 years, and she told him so one afternoon when he'd made a call on a struggling calf that was correct and quick and required no instruction from anyone. He had looked at her with the expression of someone who hadn't expected the assessment and wasn't sure what to do with it. "I'm not flattering you," she said. "I'm telling you what I see." "I know," he said. "That's why it—" He stopped. "Thank you," he said instead, which was the right choice. May, for her part, moved through the spring with the same solid, unruffled efficiency she moved through every season. But Abigail noticed, because she noticed everything, that May had started leaving the kitchen earlier on the evenings when Gus came in late from the pasture repairs, which was often, and that there was a quality to how May looked at Gus across the supper table that was not the way a cook looks at a senior ranch hand. She filed that away without comment. Some things didn't need her involvement, they just needed space, and she'd learned that not every observation required action. A letter came from Clara in April. It was not from her father or her mother, from Clara directly, in Clara's own careful handwriting, addressed to Abigail at Hartwell Ranch, Greystone Pass. Abigail opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon and read it twice. Clara wrote that things were difficult in Red Hollow, though more manageable than the winter had been. The credit line Abigail had arranged had helped, she said, not enormously, but in the specific way of a bridge doing exactly what a bridge is for, getting you to the other side. Their father's situation with the Land Commission investigation had resolved mostly in his favor, as he'd predicted it would, though the social and financial fallout of the surrounding family's troubles had left the Reed name in a diminished position in town, which Clara described with the careful neutrality of someone who has not yet decided how she feels about it. But that wasn't why she was writing. She wrote that she had been thinking about the morning Abigail left, not the morning itself, but what she hadn't said. That she had known, on some level she hadn't let herself act on, that what their parents were doing was wrong, that she had been grateful, in a way she was ashamed of, to have Abigail absorb the family's difficulties the way she always had, because it meant Clara didn't have to, that she had watched her sister walk out the door and felt relief first, and guilt second, and that the guilt had been growing slowly for months, and had become, by the time she put pen to paper, something she couldn't carry without saying something. She wasn't asking for forgiveness in so many words. She was saying she'd been wrong, and she was saying it in her own voice, without framing, without the legal precision of their father's letters or the strategic delivery of their mother's communications. Just, I was wrong. I knew it, and I didn't say so. I'm saying so now. Abigail sat with the letter for a long time. Caleb found her there and read it at her invitation, and when he finished, he set it on the table and said, "What do you want to do?" "Write back," she said. "What will you say?" She thought about it honestly. Not what she should say, not what would be generous or appropriate, but what was true. "That I appreciate her saying it," she said finally, "that it matters, and that she's welcome to visit if she ever wants to see the ranch." She paused. "Not more than that. Not yet. But the door is open." "The door is open," she said. "I'm not going to stand in front of it holding a grudge just to prove I could." He nodded once. "That's fair." "It's also self-interest," she said, because she believed in being honest about her motives. "Carrying anger at Clara doesn't cost Clara anything. It costs me." She looked at the letter. "I'm done paying for things that aren't my debt." She wrote back that evening. It was not a long letter, and it was not a warm letter in the performing warmth sense, but it was an honest one, and she meant every word of it, and she sealed it and gave it to the postwriter the next morning and let it go. The summer at Greystone Pass was the kind that people in the mountains talk about for years, warm and long, and with enough rain at the right times that the grass on the upper pastures came in thick. The cattle did well, the water rights held. The ranch expanded its herd by 12%, and Abigail spent a week in July renegotiating the feed supply contract with a supplier in the valley whose previous terms had not been in the ranch's favor. A conversation she had alone because Caleb had a fence emergency on the north section, and because she was perfectly capable of having it. She came back with better terms. Caleb read the new contract that evening and then looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to associate specifically with moments when she'd done something that he hadn't known she was going to do, and it had turned out well. It was not quite surprise and not quite pride and not quite admiration, but had elements of all three, and it was entirely his own, a face nobody else would have known how to read. "You dropped the per-head rate by 8 cents, he said. He was going to agree to 6. I asked for 10 and we landed on 8. She looked at the contract. He also extended the delivery window, which matters more than the rate adjustment in a year when the roads are soft. How did you know he'd accept 8? Because I know what his competitors are charging, and I told him so calmly, and he knew I wasn't bluffing, and he's a practical man." She shrugged. "I also told him we'd commit to a 2-year term if the rate held, which gave him something to take back to his own accounting." Caleb set the contract down. "Abigail." "It's not complicated," she said, which was genuinely how she saw it. "It's not complicated when you know what you're doing," he said. "You knew what you were doing." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The evening light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it came in summer, long and golden, catching the dust in the air and turning it briefly luminous. She was 30 years old, and she had the strange sensation, not for the first time but more clearly than before, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not in the resigned sense of someone who has stopped expecting more, but in the earned sense, the sense that comes from having chosen. She had chosen this. She had walked out of her parents' house and down the road and into a freight wagon and up into the mountains, and she had chosen this man and this ranch and this life with both eyes open, knowing full well that she was imperfect and he was imperfect, and that there would be hard winters and burned beans and arguments about horses and all the ordinary friction of two real people building something together. She had chosen it anyway. She would choose it again tomorrow. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. In the end, the story that people in the Greystone Pass territory told about the Hartwell Ranch had less to do with the herd numbers or the water rights or the expanded operation than with the quality of the place. Something in the way it ran that was hard to put a finger on, but easy to feel when you were there. People who came to do business found they were dealt with plainly. What was agreed upon was honored. Problems were acknowledged rather than managed sideways. When the Territorial Stock Association needed someone to chair the Dispute Resolution Committee for the Valley Ranchers, a thankless position that required the ability to say difficult things to difficult people without flinching and without taking it personally afterward, they asked Abigail Hartwell, and she said yes, and she ran it the way she ran everything, by paying close attention and telling the truth. She was not universally loved for this. Some people found her too direct and said so. Some people came expecting the particular deference they associated with ranchers' wives, and found instead a woman who had done her own thinking and was not apologetic about it. A few of those people adjusted their expectations. A few didn't, and those she could not help, and she'd long since made peace with that. Gus Fleury's knees got bad enough the following spring that he moved into the main house for the winter, rather than the bunkhouse, which May managed with the efficiency of a woman who had been expecting this development for some time. Nobody made a formal announcement about what that meant for May and Gus. Nobody needed to. The dog slept at the foot of the main house stairs, which it had started doing around the same time May stopped going to bed before Gus came in from the evening rounds, and that was all the announcement the situation required. Patrick Teal, by his 3rd year, was running the North Section rotations with minimal supervision. He married a woman from the valley who had strong opinions about fence design and who Abigail liked immediately, which Patrick had apparently been anxious about, and which he didn't know how to ask about, and which resolved itself the way things generally resolve themselves when you simply let them be what they were. Clara Reed visited in the autumn of the 2nd year, and it was not easy, and it was not hard in the way Abigail had braced for. It was the visit of 2 women who had grown up in the same house under the same conditions and had come out of it differently and were working out what that meant for them now, which was a slow negotiation without a clear endpoint. By the end of the week, Abigail had shown her sister the ledger system and taken her out to see the calving barn and introduced her to the horses, and Clara had asked real questions and listened to the answers, and when she left there was a quality to the parting that neither of them tried to name, but both of them felt. Something that hadn't been there before. Something that might, given time, grow. Harlan and Eleanor Reed never came to the ranch. Abigail didn't expect them to, and wasn't certain she'd have wanted them to, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise. The credit arrangement she'd made continued through 2 renewal cycles and was then no longer needed, which she took as a sign that the Reed household had found its footing in a diminished but sustainable form. She received formal letters from her father twice a year, brief, impersonal, the letters of a man who was acknowledging a relationship without knowing how to have one. She replied with equal brevity. It was not what she'd wanted when she was young. It was what there was, and she had stopped confusing those two things. What there was, she had decided, was worth more than what she'd wanted. What she'd wanted at 20 was approval from people who didn't have it to give. What she had at 30 was a life that was genuinely, specifically hers, the accumulated weight of 1,000 real decisions, 1,000 days of paying attention and doing the hard thing, and choosing truth over convenience. Nobody had given her that. She had built it in the way that things worth having are usually built, from the ground up, with her own hands, at real cost. There was an evening in late September, the third autumn at Greystone Pass, when the light came in from the west in the particular way it did in that valley. Not dramatic, no painter would have made a scene of it, just clean and level, and turning the grass on the lower pastures a shade of gold that was the particular property of that light at that season in that place. Abigail was on the porch with her coffee and the fall grazing schedule, and Caleb came and sat beside her without the schedule or the coffee or anything except the intention to sit there, which she recognized and set her papers aside for. They didn't talk for a while. The mountains were doing their late-day thing, going purple at the top and then darker, the snow line just visible on the higher peaks. The cattle were moving themselves toward the shelter fence with the herd instinct that always faintly impressed her, this collective intelligence of animals that don't think individually but somehow know together what to do. The dog was at the bottom of the porch steps looking at something in the grass with the focused intensity of a creature whose days were full of important business. "We should look at the alderman section in the spring," Caleb said. The alderman section was a parcel that had come up for sale in the valley below, not adjacent to the Hartwell property, but connected to it by a stretch of creek that made it strategically interesting. "I know," Abigail said. "I've been running the numbers." "What do you think?" "I think if the water rights transfer cleanly, it's worth the conversation. If they don't, it's a significant risk and we should pass." She looked at the lower pastures. "I'll have a clearer picture by December." He nodded. They were quiet again for a while. "My father would have just bought it," he said, "without running the numbers, without the water rights question." "I know," she said. "That's how he ended up with the rocky section that most people thought was a bad inheritance. It turned out all right." "It did." She looked at him. "Because you ran the numbers." He smiled. The real one, the rare one, that reached his eyes and changed his whole face briefly into something younger and less guarded. She had learned to collect those smiles without making him self-conscious about them, the way you learn to sit still when a rare animal comes close, because any sudden movement sends it off. "We run them," he said. "We run them," she agreed. The evening settled down around them like something that had been there all along, waiting for the right people to sit still enough to feel it. She thought about the girl who had stood in a back bedroom facing a woodshed and believed, because she'd been told it often enough, that she was someone else's problem. She thought about the morning she'd walked out of that house with her bag in her hand and the clear feeling in her chest, and about how she had not known then what the clearness was pointing toward, only that it was pointing. It had been pointing here, to this porch, this valley, this man, this ordinary and entirely real evening. She had been called too honest, too direct, too observant, too unwilling to be small. She had been written off as difficult and discarded as a burden and handed away to a stranger in the mountains like something her family had no use for. They had meant it as the end of her story. They had miscalculated badly. The truth about people who are built the way Abigail was built, clear-eyed, honest to the bone, unwilling to pretend, is that they don't need the world to give them a stage. They build their own. Not out of pride, not out of defiance, but out of the simple necessity of being what they are. You can push that kind of person to the edges. You can make them feel, for years, that being who they are is a flaw to be corrected. But you cannot make them something less than they are, not permanently, not if they have the stubbornness to keep going. The family that threw her away had, without meaning to, given her the only thing that actually mattered, The freedom to find out what she was capable of when nobody was watching and nobody was judging, and she could just be herself in the full, unedited sense of the word. That freedom had led her to a registry office to defend a man who couldn't defend himself. It had led a watching stranger to remember her for 6 years and decide she was worth knowing. It had led her up a mountain road to a ranch that needed exactly what she had to give. It had led her to a marriage that was not a rescue. She had not needed rescuing, she had needed room, but a genuine meeting of two people who had both spent too long carrying everything alone. Some people would have called it luck. She called it what it was, the result of refusing to become what other people needed her to be. The result of a very long commitment to telling the truth, even when the truth was unwelcome. That kind of commitment doesn't pay off quickly. It pays off like land does, slowly, quietly, in the accumulation of seasons, until one day you look at what you've built and understand that nothing easy would have gotten you here. The mountains went dark above the tree line, and the first stars came out over the eastern ridge. And Caleb said nothing, and she said nothing, and the dog came up the porch steps and settled at her feet with the completeness of a creature who knows exactly where it belongs. And Abigail Reed Hartwell sat in the clean mountain air and felt, all the way down, the particular peace of a woman who has finally, fully come home. Not to a place, to herself. That was the thing her family never understood. That home was not something they could give her or take away. It was something she carried, and she had always carried it, even in the back bedroom facing the woodshed, even in the cold hallway with her bag in her hand, even on the long wagon road north into the mountains with nothing certain ahead of her. She had always known who she was. She had simply needed the space to prove it.